We are celebrating the past and the future of the New York Jets franchise, most notably a Jets legend who is finally receiving a long overdue spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. That's ahead today on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Friday, February 10th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Our episode today is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, this Sunday, the Super Bowl will take place. The Philadelphia Eagles and Kansas City Chiefs will be center stage in Phoenix. One of those teams will take home the Vince Lombardi Trophy. Last night, though, the Jets were center stage. It was a night that was all about the Jets as the NFL handed out its awards for the 2022 season. The Jets made some history. The rookie class that did so well for this team in 2022 made a bit of history. We'll get to them later. But before we talk about the future of the Jets franchise, let's talk about the past, because the Jets also had a pair of great players who were elected formally to the Hall of Fame last night. One of them is a player who made it on the first ballot, no surprise, as Darrelle Revis, the great cornerback, received his spot in the Hall of Fame. But there's another player I want to talk about first. This is a player who waited long. In fact, this player waited way too long to make the Hall of Fame, and that's Joe Klecko. Joe Klecko retired in the late 80s, and I think the fact it's taken Klecko so long to get into the Hall of Fame shows you how broken the process is. I think that the Pro Football Hall of Fame needs a number of reforms. Now, I will be honest with you, Joe Klecko played before my time. I never watched him play live, so a lot of this is based on things that I've read, things that I've heard, some old clips that I've watched, and especially things that my father has told me. My father's a big Jets fan. He has been adamant for years that Joe Klecko needs to be in the Hall of Fame. In fact, I've learned not to bring Joe Klecko up around my father because you will start a rant about how it's a disgrace that Joe Klecko's not in the Hall of Fame. He'll even tell me that you need to do a podcast to try to get Joe Klecko into the Hall of Fame. And I say, I don't know how influential you really think I am that you believe a podcast I do would get Klecko into the Hall of Fame. But he had an absolutely incredible career. And if you've followed the Jets through their history, you know that I would say there are three great eras of the Jets franchise history. The first was in the late 60s, the Joe Namath, Don Maynard era, where they, of course, won their only championship in history. The second is in the 80s, where Klecko led the group known as the Sack Exchange. It was a dominant defensive line with Mark Gastineau, Abdul Salam, Marty Lyons, who is now the Jets radio analyst. And the third is the era Revis played in, which was it was a 2-year era, but it was Rex Ryan's first 2 years where the Jets almost made the Super Bowl. And Klecko was the dominant player. He was a 6th-round pick out of Temple in 1978. He was the NFL's Defensive Player of the Year in 1981. He was named All-Pro 3 different times during his career. He was named to the Pro Bowl 4 times. Here's the amazing thing about Klecko, and I talked about the 4 Pro Bowl spots. He made the Pro Bowl at 3 different positions. He made the Pro Bowl as a defensive end, as a defensive tackle, and as a nose tackle. That's an incredible feat, especially for a guy who played in the 80s. I think that feat could be matched back in the days where it was one platoon football, where guys played both offense and defense, and maybe they kicked as well. I mean, I'm sure there are people who have reached that level at different positions if you go way back. But for a player to do it in the modern era is truly remarkable. And I think one of the things Klecko struggled with, in addition to just the Hall of Fame process being broken, is I don't think that football, and professional football in particular, is a sport where there's a great sense of history. There are lots of baseball historians who go back and they'll tell you things that happened decades ago. Football, there's a real bias toward the modern game. I think part of it is the game of football is so dominated by TV, and the NFL was not always on TV. And so I think, even though it was in Klecko's days, but it was not. We did not have direct TV when Klecko was playing, so games were not shown across the country. It was not. It just wasn't the sport it is today. There was no internet that allowed you to follow every team. It was a regional sport for a very long time. It was not the national game it is today. And beyond that, I think one of the reasons there's a lot of history knowledge in baseball is a sport where stats are kept, and stats really reflect your ability on the field. In football, stats don't tell you everything, and beyond that, the key stat for Klecko or for any defensive lineman people typically look to is sacks. And sacks were not kept officially until 1982. Klecko's greatest season was 1981. And in recent years, and this probably helped him, there actually have been people who went back and rewatched those games, and they actually have been able to produce sack totals for you. In 1981, Klecko was the Defensive Player of the Year. So he had the award. I don't think people realize he had 20 and a half sacks that season. But because I think there's been more research in recent years, maybe somebody like Klecko, who tended to fly under the radar in the past, was able to build maybe some momentum for his Hall of Fame candidacy. There was a great book written by a Jets fan, a guy named Greg Prado, back in 2011, that I had the opportunity to read. It's called The Sack Exchange. It was an oral history of that era, and the Jets, had some really good teams in that era. The Jets almost made a couple of Super Bowls. There was a famous game that again, this is before my time, but a lot of longtime fans will remember the Mud Bowl in Miami when the Jets lost in the AFC Championship game. In 1986, the Jets, the 86 season, I think it was early 87. The Jets lost this horrible game in Cleveland where Gastineau had a bad roughing the passer penalty. So the Jets came close. It was a divisional game. The Jets came close. They never quite made it. It was similar. It was a longer run than the Rex years produced, but it was similar that they had really good teams and they just fell a bit short. And I highly recommend if you'd like to learn more about Joe Klecko and that overall era of Jets football. The book again was called The Sack Exchange by an author, Greg Prado, who's a big Jets fan, and I'll leave the Amazon link to this book in the show notes so you can buy it. I highly recommend it. It's a great book, and it's just nice to see that a Jets legend is getting his due. Joe Klecko has belonged in the Hall of Fame for a long time. And I say that as somebody who maybe didn't watch Klecko. I was, again, too young to be able to see him play in person. But the more you watch, the more you learn, the more you realize what a great player this guy was. It's something that in my view, is long overdue. And finally, Joe Klecko's in the Hall of Fame. And you know what's great about it? The other thing that's great about it is the Jets have had this tendency to have Hall of Fame players, but at the very end of their career, where these guys are in the Hall of Fame, but it has nothing to do with what they did with the Jets. I mean, you can go back to the 90s where they had Ronnie Lott, where they had Art Monk. You could go on to the 2000s. We could talk Brett Favre. We could talk Jason Taylor. We could talk LaDainian Tomlinson. I mean, there are so many different names. Ed Reed was with the team for a brief stretch in 2013. It's nice to have actual Jets legends make the Hall of Fame. We had that a couple of years ago with Kevin Mawai, and now we have it with Joe Klecko. And we also have it with Darrelle Revis. I've talked about how Joe Klecko represents one great Jets era. Well, there's a second Jet going into the Hall of Fame this year, and he represents another great Jets era. That's Darrelle Revis. And we'll talk about what Revis's enshrinement in the Hall of Fame means as we continue on this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Blue Nile. Valentine's Day is coming up. Don't panic. Romance is in the air more than usual, and I don't need to tell all you lovebirds that you've probably had your date plans on the calendar for weeks. But have you found the perfect Valentine's Day gift yet? Whether you're celebrating this day of romance or whether you're ready to pop the question, you can find jewelry as unique as she is with the modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. At BlueNile.com, you can find the perfect piece of jewelry for life's special moments or even create the custom engagement ring of her dreams. Their simple online tools let you choose the diamond, shape, size, and clarity, as well as the setting style. Blue Nile's bench jewelers will then handcraft the perfect piece for your specifications. Blue Nile provides expert guidance, in-depth educational materials, and unique online tools that place you in control. So you can forget about the usual hassles of the jewelry shopping experience and focus on the romance. Blue Nile's diamond price guarantee allows you to compare a competitor's diamond against one of theirs. Blue Nile can even meet or beat their price. And right now you can save up to 50% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com for up to 50% off. BlueNile.com. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. This year, the only app you need at your Super Bowl party is FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we're very excited to have FanDuel as our new sports betting partner at Locked On, because if you've been to FanDuel, you know that they have many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download FanDuel now so you can bet on Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 in bonus bets, so if your first bet doesn't win, FanDuel lets you bet everything on the money line from point spreads to who will score a touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. Super Bowl's only a couple days away, so join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Friday. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. It's a great day for the New York Jets franchise because they had two players elected to the Hall of Fame last night, Joe Klecko and Darrelle Revis. Now, Darrelle Rivas took a different path than Joe Klecko to get to the Hall of Fame. Revis was well known as the best corner in the NFL for about a 3 to 4 year stretch, and he went in on the first ballot. I think everybody knew Revis was going in. We talked about the Jets of the 80s. I was not around to watch them, so I'm kind of going off what my father's told me, things that I've read, old clips that I've seen. Revis I was there for. And Revis, again, he was the undisputed top corner in the NFL for a stretch there with the Jets. And actually had his second stint did not go that well because the Jets re-signed him. Jets traded him to Tampa in 2013. In 2014, he went to New England and won a Super Bowl. And for the life of me, I will never understand why the Jets were not more aggressive in trying to sign him when he went to the Patriots. Jets had no interest in him, and I will never understand that. Revis came back to the Jets in 2015 and had one last Pro Bowl season and then really declined steeply. And the contract ended up being really bad for the Jets because they were paying him a ton of money, and he went into total decline. But when he was at his best, he was something special. The NFL of this era is essentially built to help passing offenses succeed. The rules against pass interference are so pronounced that it's just difficult to play corner. It's really tough to play effectively, and because of these rules, you could argue there's no such thing as a shutdown corner anymore. There are only a handful of exceptions, and Revis was one of those exceptions. And I think the 2009 season in particular, which was the first of the two AFC Championship game seasons Rex Ryan had, Revis put together as dominant of a season as you will ever see. And part of it was just based on the Jets scheme. The Jets were a heavy man-to-man team that year. But not only were they a heavy man-to-man team, they blitzed a ton because it was, Rex Ryan's a guy who loves to send heat at the quarterback. And the Jets did not really have many edge rushers who could get to the quarterback one-on-one. So to get home and generate pressure, they had to send blitzes. But Revis didn't just match up with receivers. He essentially, for the full game, found the best receiver on the other team and followed him around. If the guy went left, Revis went left. The guy went right, Revis went right. The guy went into the slot, Revis went into the slot. That's how the Jets built their scheme. And it helped the team so much because, what would happen is, first of all, they knew they could lock the other team's receiver up one-on-one. And when you're under pressure as a quarterback, you're typically going to throw to your best target. You're typically going to trust your best receiver. They got nothing against Revis. And in the instances where the Jets did not blitz, what they did frequently was run what's known as a lot of combo coverage, which essentially means that they put Revis one-on-one in man coverage against the other team's best receiver, and they played zone everywhere else. And essentially what they did was they stuck guys on the other side of the field. They just loaded the other side of the field with players to constrict the passing lanes because they knew Revis could handle the other team's best receiver one-on-one. And Revis was one of the driving forces behind the Jets' success, not just in 2009, but also in 2010. And even later on, even when the team wasn't as successful, he was still great up till 2016. Revis is an interesting case because he's not that beloved by the fan base. And I think that will change in the years ahead as people appreciate just how great he was during his career. But part of the story with Revis with the Jets was, the contract negotiations with him were very acrimonious. When they drafted him in 2007, he held out his first training camp. He was not in camp on time because of a holdout. He also held out after the 2009 season where he was so dominant. People hated him for that. I always thought it was fair. He was the best corner in the league. He had outperformed his contract. I had no issue with him holding out, but it created a lot of bad blood, and it probably led to the Jets trading him in 2013 when he was due a new contract, and he was traded to Tampa Bay. The Jets ended up getting 2 draft picks in return, one of whom turned into Sheldon Richardson, who ended up being a really good player, the other of whom turned into Jalen Saunders, who, to put it mildly, did not. But it left a lot of frustration, and even when Rivas returned to the Jets in 2015, it felt like there was a lot of bad. There were some fans who embraced him, like me, because I loved his greatness. Other fans, did not love him so much. That was part of his legacy. I think things will begin to improve now. He's going into the Hall of Fame as the Jet, and it always felt to me that the contract negotiations with Rivas were never personal. He genuinely loved the franchise. In fact, I mean, that because of what happened last offseason. He has a relative. I don't know if you know this. Rivas is actually related to Jordan Whitehead. And Whitehead said that, he talked to Rivas when he was looking for teams to sign, and Rivas had nothing but good things to say about the Jets. He loves the franchise. And he was really, the Jets had a lot of great players drafted in this 2-year stretch between 06 and 07. That's when they drafted DeBrickashaw Ferguson in 06. They drafted Nick Mangold the same year. A year later, they drafted David Harris in the second round. But the best of these players was Darrelle Revis. There are not many times in Jets franchise history where you can point at a player and say, that guy was the best at his position, and it wasn't even close. And that's what's true about Darrelle Revis during that era. The Jets built their defense around him. The Jets built one of the best defenses in the NFL around Darrelle Revis in that era. Especially those early Rex days. And he dominated. He delivered. It's one thing to, like I said, it's one thing to go to the left side every play. And if you dominate, you dominate. Richard Sherman was doing it at that era. That's what Sauce Gardner does. And I don't want to take anything away from Sauce, because Sauce is pretty awesome. But it's another thing to just play one-on-one against the other team's best receiver all game. In fact, that year in 2009 I was talking about, where he was absolutely robbed of the defense. It makes me, I don't care about awards. I'm still angry about 2009 when Charles Woodson won the Defensive Player of the Year award over Rivas. And it's because the media bought into this nonsense narrative, because Charles Woodson was playing safety and he played the slot and he played outside at corner. And the media built this ridiculous narrative that because Woodson did all these different things, therefore he was inherently better than Rivas. It was nonsense then. It's nonsense now. But if you look back to that 2009 season, I'll give you an amazing stat, is Rivas matched up against the other team's number one receiver 67% of plays. So 2/3 of the time, he was matched up against the other team's best receiver. That number kind of skews how frequently Rivas matched up against elite receivers, because the Jets only matched him up against the other team's number one receiver when they felt like the other team's number one receiver was an elite player. Other than that, they just pick a side for Rivas to go to. So if the other team didn't really have a great threat, Rivas wouldn't follow the other guy around. It was only when they thought the other teams had a receiver who could be a difference maker. It's, I'm sure we'll see great corners again. In fact, the Jets have a great corner right now, Sauce Gardner. But it's amazing to think of how great Rivas was. And I don't think numbers can ever do justice to how good Darrelle Rivas was that season. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about Sauce Gardner. Well, we will shift our attention from the past to the future of the Jets, because there's some exciting news, and a couple of Jets rookies who had phenomenal seasons were awarded last night. In fact, the Jets, as a franchise, made some history by sweeping the Rookie of the Year awards, and we'll discuss that as we continue this Friday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by TurboTax. Go to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Meet with an expert who will do them for you. TurboTax experts can relieve you from the stress of taxes and file for you so you can do, not taxes. Show your eyes things that are not taxes. Unpack a moving box of not taxes. Taste not taxes. Sing not taxes a lullaby. Hope not taxes sleeps through the night. Grab a saddle and ride not taxes into the sunset. With TurboTax, an expert will do your taxes from start to finish, ensuring your taxes are done right, guaranteed, so you can relax. It feels good to be done with your taxes, doesn't it? Come to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Visit TurboTax.com to learn more. Intuit TurboTax. Full service products only. Video meeting while your expert does your taxes required. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Friday, we're talking about Jets past and Jets future. I just said that I don't really care about awards. I gave you one exception, though, and that was the 2009 Defensive Player of the Year award when Darrelle Revis was, let's put it plainly, Darrelle Revis was absolutely robbed of the 2009 Defensive Player of the Year award. Fortunately, last night, the Jets won a couple of Rookie of the Year awards. They became actually only the third team in history to have players win both the Offensive Rookie of the Year and Defensive Rookie of the Year. Garrett Wilson was named Offensive Rookie of the Year. Sauce Gardner was named Defensive Rookie of the Year. And here's the amazing thing. If Breece Hall had not gotten hurt, I think there's a pretty good chance he would have won Offensive Rookie of the Year. Isn't that amazing? The Jets really had three guys who could have been a Rookie of the Year this year. Tells you something about that draft class, doesn't it? For Garrett Wilson, I think he gives the Jets something they've lacked in a while. In fact, I think you could say the Jets have lacked a go-to guy on offense since Brandon Marshall in 2015. Brandon Marshall had a phenomenal 2015 season with this team. Then he kind of regressed in 2016 and his career was essentially over. Jets have been searching for that go-to guy since, and they've used plenty of draft picks to try and find him. They even in recent years, they tried to draft Denzel Mims in the second round of 2020. Really did not work out that well. They tried to draft Elijah Moore, second round of 2021. Seemed like we were on the right track his rookie year. Year two, not so much. Garrett Wilson finally gives that guy the Jets they can run their offense through. He pretty much hit the ground running. I mean, week two, he went over 100 yards. He had a pair of touchdowns, including the game winner in the Jets' amazing victory over the Cleveland Browns. It's nice to finally have a building block on offense. And I think through the years, we've tried to talk ourselves into guys we tried to convince ourselves guys were as good as Garrett Wilson. We did that with Mims. I mean, I did that with Mims myself. I did that with Elijah Moore, where they show you just enough where you feel like, all right, maybe he can improve to a point where he will be that guy. Garrett Wilson was that guy immediately, and it's very exciting to think about where his career is going. And the same goes for Sauce Gardner. And, I really hope you did not take away from that last segment when I was comparing him to Revis that I think anything negative about Sauce Gardner, because he's phenomenal. I mean, he's already like a top 3 corner in this league. He's first team All-Pro as a rookie. And listen, not being Darrell Rivas is not exactly a criticism. And I'll say this, I don't know that Sauce Gardner's ever going to be as good as Rivas, but one thing about career trajectory, and I'm not going to knock Rivas, now please don't take this as a knock on Rivas. I don't know where Sauce is going, but if you're comparing rookie years, Sauce did have a better rookie year than Rivas. This is a league, I just said it, there are not many shutdown corners, and the Jets have a shutdown corner in Sauce Gardner. And, we don't know what the future will hold for Robert Saleh, but I'll tell you something. A guy who can cover one-on-one like Sauce, he's going to be great in any scheme. Any scheme you want, this is a premium player that you need on your football team. And I guess this brings me to the broader point is, it's very easy to be pessimistic about this franchise. I mean, when you lose 6 in a row, especially when you start 5-2, 6-3, 7-4, you think your team's heading to the playoffs, and then you end the season on a horrific 6-game losing streak where it feels like nothing can go right. It's very easy to feel down, especially when you've been in a decade-plus playoff drought. It's frustrating. But it's a reminder that things are getting better. The Jets are moving in the right direction. I don't know whether Joe Douglas is ultimately going to be the right GM for this team. In fact, I mean, I think there are increasing signs that, he might not be. But the one thing I do feel confident in saying is that even if a year from now we're looking for a new GM, Joe Douglas will be the first Jets GM since, I would say, Bill Parcells, who we can say left the team better than he found it. Because after Parcells, we had Terry Bradway, who inherited a decent roster, but also a tough cap situation from Parcells. And by the time he left, the Jets were in awful shape. They had a terrible cap situation. They did not have a good roster. Mike Tannenbaum took over. He essentially left the team about as bad as he found them. Now, the Tannenbaum journey was interesting because there was a rapid ascent, but just as rapid of a fall. So, I mean, Tannenbaum, you actually experienced some real highs, but things fell quickly, and by the end, you were about where you started. John Idzik really wasn't around long enough to move the team situation materially. Mike McCagnon somehow made it worse. Joe Douglas came in, and again, I mean, a lot of the results have not been great, but I will say this, I do think the team's in a better spot, and it's because you have young building blocks like Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson. And yeah, Breece Hall. There's actually some young talent. There's a base of young talent the Jets can build on here, and that's the first time you can say that in a very long time for this franchise. And ironically, it might be the first time you can say that since Darrelle Revis was just drafted, and the Jets had that young core. And maybe this young core will bring us I've talked about the three great Jets eras. Maybe this young core will bring us the fourth great Jets era. And who knows, maybe someday down the line we'll be talking about them the way we talk about Joe Klecko and Darrelle Revis. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great weekend, everybody. Enjoy the Super Bowl. We'll be back on Monday.